Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I would like to welcome you to episode 5 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today, I would like to take on the topic or the subject of transaction monitoring. This first became a public issue in the world of anti-corruption and anti-bribery compliance back in April of 2012 in the Morgan Stanley Declination. If you'll recall, in this declination to prosecute, the U.S. Department of Justice listed several reasons why they chose not to prosecute Morgan Stanley for the conduct of its managing director, Garth Peterson, in violating the FCPA. One of the reasons was transaction monitoring. And apparently through transaction monitoring, Morgan Stanley picked up that its employee Peterson had engaged in activity that was later found to violate the FCPA, or which apparently Peterson agreed violated the FCPA. And Morgan Stanley asked him some pretty pointed questions, which he denied either engaging in the transaction or engaging in conduct which was at odds with Morgan Stanley, its code of conduct, or its conflict of interest policy. That information was all provided to the U.S. government. The government decided not to prosecute Morgan Stanley, and hence the reason for the declination. For the compliance community, this declination was significant because it was the first public pronouncement of a declination to prosecute. Obviously, declinations have been ongoing for some time by the Department of Justice in the FCPA arena. We hear about them through corporations making Q or K announcements, where they'll indicate the government is no longer investigating them. The government typically, however, does not publicly announce information regarding declinations to prosecute, although this changed in the FCPA guidance, which was released last November. But I'd like to go back to the Morgan Stanley case because it was the first time the government had publicly commented on transaction monitoring. And they specifically noted that transaction monitoring was one of the 8 factors, I believe, which led them to give Morgan Stanley the declination. Now, if we move forward to the fall of 2012 up and until December, there was a SEC civil enforcement action under the FCPA, which I think really drove home the need for transaction monitoring. And that was the Lilly enforcement action. In that enforcement action, which was not an FCPA criminal matter brought by the Department of Justice, but a civil matter only for books and records violations, and I think that's significant. Lilly was found to have engaged in 4 bribery schemes in 4 different countries across the globe. 2 of those directly impacted, I believe, transaction monitoring. And the bribery schemes were employees were submitting false expense reports to obtain additional monies from the company to fund bribery and corruption in China. In Russia, offshore agents were used from the island of Cyprus, or at least engaged, and funds were paid to these offshore agents, and it turned out that these were either owned by Russian governmental officials or controlled by Russian governmental officials. But 2 of the bribery schemes were as follows. In Brazil, Lilly used a distributor model, and they had a range of discounts that were given to distributors who could then resell Lilly products at their cost or whatever cost they could obtain. And typically, this range was 6 to 12%. Further, there was a distributor committee which reviewed applications for distributors to sell products into Brazil, and there was one specific or particular distributor who was given a discount of 17%, which obviously is outside the range that Lilly had previously granted. This distributor was recommended by the Brazilian country manager to the committee. Apparently, no background due diligence was done on this distributor, and the committee rubber stamped the request of the country manager for this distributor to be utilized. Unfortunately, the 5% difference of 17 to 12% was utilized to fund bribes, which were paid to hospital administrators in a particular province in Brazil, and this conduct violated the FCPA. So Lilly got into trouble for using the distributor model in Brazil. But in Poland, a different method was used. And in Poland, in the province of Silesia, the Director General of the Silesian Healthcare Service, the person who had final say over contracts, business, and retention of business by Lilly in the province of Silesia, was also the founder of a charitable organization in Poland. This charity was called the Charitable Foundation. And the Charitable Foundation, although it was a reputable charitable organization, its functions was to restore castles in the country of Poland. It was not in any way, shape, or form connected with the healthcare industry. And in this situation, or in this scenario, Lilly made charitable donations to the Charitable Foundation at or near the time that contracts were either up for renewal or decisions on reimbursements were due from the Director General. And in the SEC complaint, there was actually a chart which tied these two together. Sometimes within 24 hours of a donation being made, a decision was made by the Director General, or 24 hours after a decision was made, a charitable donation was made. These donations were not particularly large. Over a period of 2 to 3 years, the largest donation was, I believe, $7,500. Nevertheless, they added up to over $200,000 over this time period. And these donations, although they went through a charitable donation committee, once again with the similar situation in Brazil, they were rubber stamped. The donations were not vetted in any way. It was not a determination of what was the charitable purpose for the donations, nor was there any showing of how the donations tied to any overall pattern or plan of giving by Lilly in Poland or any other countries. Typically, Lilly's charitable donations involved pharmaceuticals, medical services, or general healthcare industry issues. So you had two different bribery schemes in Brazil and Poland, which I think lend themselves to transaction monitoring. And why I think transaction monitoring is important, because particularly in Poland, I think if there is I should have said that the donations made significantly increased the sales by Lilly into the province of Silesia, making that province the highest grossing province for Lilly in the country of Poland. So you have a clear sales spike. And I think it's important that if there's a sales spike, you now need to monitor that transaction or their series of transactions from the compliance perspective. I certainly hope from a business perspective you understand the reason that you have a sales spike. Clearly business purpose for obtaining that information. But now I think you need to look at it from the compliance perspective. If you have such a sales spike, what's the reason? Is it because you have a super salesman in the country? Is you have a super sales team in the country? Is it because you have a new product? Is it because you have a new initiative? Is it because you have some sort of rebate or product offering that makes your products or services extremely desirable? What's the reason? I spoke to Phil Wiedemeyer, who is on the board of directors at several companies, and Phil is an auditor, and he comes at things from an auditing perspective. And his question to me was, he would want to know, as a board of director, why did you have that sales spike and what information do you have? So what information did Lilly have available to it to show the reasons for the sales spike? They need to tie together the events of the donation to the business development that they were able to obtain. And how do you do that? You do that through transaction monitoring. Transaction monitoring is looking at a large number of transactions and trying to determine if there are any red flags. The Lilly enforcement action, to me, drives home the significance of looking at sales spikes from the compliance perspective. But I think the Department of Justice has expanded this concept of ongoing monitoring and even transaction monitoring a little bit more broadly. And they're suggesting that you do have ongoing monitoring. Clearly, in the area of third parties, you need to monitor your third parties at time periods greater than simply contract renewal, so that you need to assess your third parties, if not on an ongoing real-time basis, certainly more than every couple of years. The semi-annually, quarterly, monthly, there are some services that even do this, like I said, on a real-time basis. So your ongoing monitoring of third parties, and their key here is the status of the party changed? Have they become a politically exposed person? Has some information become available which would indicate that that party has a propensity for bribery or corruption? All of the things that you look at in due diligence should be, all of that types of information should be obtained in your ongoing monitoring going forward. You simply cannot have a static program. But with transaction monitoring, the key once again is to identify red flags. You can look at employee spend, travel and entertainment. If you have a high amount of travel and entertainment, if you have duplicate requests for information, for reimbursement on travel and entertainment, many different ways that employees can utilize expense reports to generate monies, to generate funds, and this can be used for bribery and corruption. Indeed, this was what the trouble Lilly got into in China. The employees were defrauding the company, but they weren't defrauding it for their personal benefit. They were defrauding it for the to obtain additional monies to pay bribes. So indirectly, I suppose you could say they were defrauding the company for personal benefit. Nevertheless, the money that they obtained from their fraudulent reimbursement requests were going to governmental officials and other persons who had decision-making authority over contracts with Lilly. So transaction monitoring is going to be important going forward. Transaction monitoring is not a be-all, end-all or in itself. It's simply there to identify outliers, red flags, if you will, that then should be followed up for further information. You can look at overall transactions. You can look at individuals. You can look at series of spends. You're really only limited by your imagination on the types of information that you can monitor and how you can slice it and dice it. So I hope you will consider that in your compliance program going forward. I find it to be an important tool going forward. And clearly, if the Department of Justice thinks that transaction monitoring is important enough to mention in a declination to prosecute, it means that you should consider that for your compliance program going forward. If you need more information on this subject or would like to contact me about it, I'm available, or you can reach me rather at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. My next podcast, I'm going to speak with Patrick Taylor, who is the president of Oversight Systems that has a transaction monitoring tool. And Patrick's going to explain how that tool is used and how you can utilize that in your compliance program. So I hope this will give you, between this podcast and my interview with Patrick, a good insight into what transaction monitoring is and how you can use that going forward. So thank you very much.